From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will center his weekly grain market comments on the beleaguered corn market, offering his latest probability projections on corn prices for the rest of the marketing year. He's strongly encouraging new corn growers to watch for opportunities to favorably manage the considerable price risk currently. Then K-State's Romulo Lollato will provide the latest update on potential freeze injury to the Kansas winter wheat crop, following that string of sub-freezing overnight temperatures that occurred last week. He'll remind you producers what to be looking for as you inspect your stands. And standing by to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today as we take up the grain markets once again. Dan O'Brien is back, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. He's stationed in Colby, northwest Kansas. That's where he joins us from via internet chat today. Dan, we're going to focus most of our attention this time around to what is probably the most unsettled of the major grain trades, although you could probably argue for all of these being in that condition as well, given the current state of economic affairs out there. But that would be the corn market. We have several angles here, including your latest set of price probability projections for corn. We'll get to that. You bring up first, though, that there are interesting things happening in the grain price ratios relevant to corn.
Yes, relevant to corn in Kansas. Corn, soybeans, and wheat, actually, all as they relate. The ratio of hard red winter wheat May futures to corn futures is, well, it's built on, you're looking about 485.5 per bushel prices for closes yesterday on April 23rd for hard red winter wheat. That compared to a front end May contract close of 319.25 for corn. It's a ratio of 1.5. And when you look at what we typically talk about for incentive to feed wheat, well, we look at about 1.04, 1.05. So these type of price differentials, maybe the safest thing to say in all of agricultural markets is that we have less incentive to feed hard red winter wheat right now than we've had in the past. And when you look at the area of the state where we'd be doing that type of thing, at Garden City, Kansas, at the cash price on yesterday's closes, based on what the Ag Marketing Services said, it's about $3.14 for corn, for wheat $4.43. So again, 1.4. So you've got two commodities that wasn't in too distant a past were near par for pricing. Well, now wheat, with all the issues that we've had in our own crop that we're waiting to figure out the impact of, i.e. wheat freezes and other issues, that as well as kind of a protectionism, cautiousness by other major exporters in the world, Russia, Ukraine for sure, and other issues again, Australia, elsewhere. So huge price differential there. Grain sorghum, as I calculate the numbers, cash price in grain sorghum in Garden City is about $3.19. On yesterday's close, the corn price $3.14. So again, now you're seeing the pickup increase in export movement, export strength for grain sorghum, and that's ending up and has brought grain sorghum now to a higher price than for corn. And what's being reflected in that corn price, again, is all this 1, 2, 3, 4 in a row sets of negative demand news that is basically rocked the usage side of the corn supply demand balance sheet.
Well, and we touched upon this in an earlier conversation this week, what's been going on in the oil market and the ripple effects on the biofuels trade, disaffecting the corn market. That hasn't improved since we last visited about this, Dan.
No, you really see that showing up in terms of the bids that ethanol plants across the country are giving for corn inputs. Again, we were seeing 20, 30, 40 cent positive basis at ethanol plants in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Well, now we're even par for the best bids. Again, even with futures, or maybe 5 cents over best bids in the country. Again, 5 cents over May futures. And that number not that long ago was 30, 40 cents. And within the last several months, at times it's 50, 60 or more. In Kansas, our bids for corn at ethanol plants still pretty healthy, 5 under to 5 over. Again, 312.5 to 322.5 for cash prices. Grain sorghum bids aren't that bad either. Ethanol plants still in Kansas, 307.5 as the cash price bid for grain sorghum at ethanol plants, and that's 10 cents under the May futures. So I think that's something to watch. It is interesting to look at the price of ethanol that's being sold out of those same plants in Kansas, ranging from 73 cents to 86 cents. Not as bad as we've seen for gasoline prices for RBOB, which is markedly lower than that. And again, the real issues, as we've been noting, that whole industry's been noting, has been the drop in the RBOB prices and the low profitability. On Monday of this week, the Renewable Fuels Association came out and indicated that 46% of U.S. ethanol production capacity was idled. Some of that, and they were naming the number of plants that were either shut down or had slowed down their production in what I think you'd call a very defensive move. So that industry right now is I think it's fair to say, and they would say it, is reeling with the overall impact of what's happened in U.S. energy demand that's worked its way to affect both the oil industry and the closely associated ethanol industry. So just really challenging times, and that in particular is a driving factor for our outlook for corn prices heading off into the next year. And you just cannot emphasize how important it is to have some recovery in U.S. gasoline, ethanol, energy usage to bring back better prospects for profitability for both the oil industry and the ethanol industry and for corn producers here in the U.S.
Well, all of this does, in fact, filter down into your latest price probability projections for corn, what you've lined out here, and all of this is detailed in your weekly notes on the grain markets. 3 scenarios that could develop depending on basically the yield of the 2020 crop and the corresponding likely prices that will result from this year's production. When you look at the numbers you've come up with, some of these, Dan, are perilously close to the loan rate.
Well, no one is wishing that we see prices back down to the loan rate. And national loan rate for corn was raised last year, thankfully, 25 cents. It was $1.95 in the last farm bill. Now it's $2.20 per bushel. And I think the grain sorghum is the same. And if we come forward and would have acreage at, again, just under 97 million as the USDA had projected earlier, and the type of yields they talked about, 178.5, that was projected in the 2020 Ag Outlook Conference in February, well, then we'd be looking at 15.8 billion bushels of corn, total supplies just under about 18 billion bushels, and be sitting there facing situation where the projections that we had been making for ethanol usage of corn of about 5.45 billion, probably now, given what we just talked about and the risk going forward, is that something between 4 and 4.5 billion bushels of corn? And that's really counting on some type of recovery. And I think as we're moving that direction, we'll see that. But instead of 5.4, 5.5 billion, you're plugging in, say, 4.25 billion bushels, and taking wet corn milling, again, other non-ethanol food seed industrial usage down by about the same percentage, and actually probably keeping feed usage about the same as we had this year. Exports probably on the bright side because we have low corn prices. So you bring all that together and you have ending stocks, the possibility of ending stocks for this next marketing year the 2020-21 marketing year, running from 3.4 to 4.3 billion bushels, depending on what the yields are. And with that, it looks to me historically that if we have something over 30% stocks to use corn, that basically you're at the loan rate. That's how prices would tend to be. So the U.S. national price would get down to about that level, and we'd be back to thinking about how best to manage LDPs and things like that.
Who would have imagined that?
Well, we didn't until the coronavirus came in and so dramatically affected the U.S. economy. And, it forced what has happened just in a very defensive, health-oriented move. But if we have closer to, say, 14.5 billion bushels with the type of usage scenarios we talked about, well, then you're looking at a 250, 260 price. Really, I think the most important question that I would encourage ag producers right now to think about is, first of all, to look it straight in the eye and realize that there's risk of this, and know that if we get 220 or 250 cash corn prices, that you're looking at futures probably 250 to 280. And right now, D's corn is close to about 338. Are there moves that we can make to protect ourselves from that low outcome? So there is the risk of that happening now. That's the quote in the tail of the distribution. But for us to avoid that, we'll have to see usage increase or a crop problem, and something that would give us a lot less than 3.4 to 4.3 billion bushels of ending stocks and stocks to uses of 26 to 33, 35%. So there's a risk of that outcome out there. And it would just be really, really judicious, I think, to look at what we have now in the market and to think what we need to do to make sure we're not just down at the loan rate, given the possibility of that happening out here in fall of 2020.
Well, all of this, again, is captured in the aforementioned weekly notes on the grain trades that Dan puts together. Those are posted at the agmanager.info website. Dan, as always, thanks for the observations.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
With his weekly grain market analysis and comment, Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension grain market economist. And this is Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, as on this segment we revisit the topic of freeze injury to winter wheat in Kansas. And we've had more rounds of freezing temperatures since the first time we brought this up with our guest, Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And so we'll go over what has happened last week in specific, Romulo, with freezing temperatures multiple times. But you have actually been touring fields directly as well and trying to get a sense of what's happening out there likewise.
Hi, Eric. Yeah, as well. Thanks for having me here on air today. Mm-hmm. Again, the topic of freeze damage, and this time maybe we're considerably more concerned than what we were last time. So remember that we had that freeze event on April 3rd. We talked about it. There was some risk, especially to the most advanced fields, but overall a low risk. And then we had that week of April 13th through the 17th, where essentially we had freeze every night. Of course, the coldest night was on April 13th, and that's where the greatest risk was. But again, because we had so many nights in a row, we're essentially looking at that period as a one big period of how many hours were we below thresholds, what was the minimal temperature that occurred, and what was the crop growth stage during that week. So definitely from this latest round of freeze, we are not only at considerable risk, but we are already seeing some damage in fields in parts of the state. Just a brief overview again of what we need to consider when we're assessing the risk of freeze damage. One of it is how far along is the crop. And that's important because that changes the sensitivity to temperature. And so a crop that is further along is going to be more sensitive to cold temperatures. For instance, the crop in south central Kansas is going to be much further along than the crop in northwest Kansas. In fact, we were estimating that during that freeze, the crop in south central Kansas was about anywhere between jointing and flag leaf emergence, whereas the crop in northwest Kansas is still late tillering. When the leaves are coming, it's starting to be upright. In the central swath in the state, Salina and through Hayes and southwest to Garden City, that entire area, we were estimating to be about jointing or so. Coincidentally, where the crop was further along, the temperatures were not as cold, luckily. So we are not too concerned with the south central part of the state, and where the crop was behind, which is the far northwest part of the state, the temperatures they were very low, but the crop was actually behind. And so that combination puts us at a little bit more comfort there as well. Really, where we're expecting and seeing most of the damage is on that central portion of the state. So it's probably starting in Saline County there through Ellis County and going north from there, at least for one or two counties north from that region, and southwest from there as we get to Rush County, Ness County, Finney County, and that southwest part of the state. So really the main things that are leading us to believe that that's going to be the area at the greatest risk is the crop was already jointed for the most part. Perhaps a crop that was further along could have been reaching that second node already. And temperatures were extremely cold. We had up to, 7, 8, 10 hours below 24 degrees, which is about the threshold for a crop that is jointed. So that combination really puts that area at the greatest risk based on crop growth stage, minimum temperatures attained, and also how long were cold temperatures sustained.
Once more, you have taken this one further and have been inspecting directly a few fields around and about. Where have you been and what have you seen yourself then, Romulo?
So, Eric, because I wanted to leave the area with the highest probability for last, because I wanted to give it a little bit more time to really show the symptoms, so far I've been to kind of south central part of the state, just south of that McPherson area. So about McPherson down to Reno County, down to Harper, Sumner County. So that south central region where temperatures were on the threshold, but we were not too concerned yet. And again, I want to give it more time in the area with the highest risk so I can actually have a better picture there. In that area, as the fields in Saline County, they're definitely showing quite a bit of damage, not only leaf damage, because from the road now, essentially everything in that county kind of looks burned back and yellow. But we're seeing anywhere from 10% up to maybe 40% of the main tillers. They're essentially gone. You can tell that those heads, they are mushy and they're pretty much gone. On the flip side, the majority of the secondary tillers, they are still healthy. The crop has enough tillers still to have a pretty decent yield in that region, but we will depend on moisture. Now, of course, the yield potential, we have brought it down, right? We put a cap on our yield potential, but it can still yield decently as long as we have a good moisture and relatively cool conditions moving forward. As we move south from there, the cold damage becomes less obvious, so much so that in that Reno County region, we're still seeing quite a bit of leaf burn, but I have not found more than maybe 10% of those primary tillers dried back. So I wouldn't expect much economic damage from that. We might see that whenever the head tries to emerge from the whorl, we might see it getting trapped and maybe coming out from the side of the boot or things along these lines. But as long as we're finding less than about 10% or so of those primary tillers killed by the frost, we should still have a pretty decent yield potential. And now in Sumner County, I really was not able to find any head that was killed by the frost, just some leaf damage. Now the crop is quite a bit further along. We're at the boot stage there already. So we'll see if we're going to have any head trapping or not. So again, I have visited so far the area where we were expecting not as much damage as in other parts of the state. So I could give it a little bit more time before I visit the central and southwest part of the state where we might see more damage.
And as far as what growers should do if they are suspicious of said damage in central Kansas and southwest Kansas, they too need to be scouting their fields over the next week or so to see if there are signs of damage, much as you described there, Romulo.
Yeah, so right now they could already be starting. So we've been for about a week or so since the freeze. So definitely growers could be scouting and trying to find freeze damage. Again, talking to growers in the Ellis County region and Osborne County, Smith County, that area, seems like they're finding already quite a bit of damage. Seems like that damage was also variety specific. Some of the varieties that were able to hold to winter dormancy for a little bit longer, it doesn't seem like they felt it as much compared to a variety that was released from that winter dormancy earlier and was already a little bit more advanced in growth. So there are these variety-specific differences. We're also hearing reports that fields that were planted after soybeans or fields that were planted late, we usually say that, well, they're going to be behind in development, and so maybe we can expect less damage on those. But at the same time, on the flip side, they have a much thinner canopy, right? And so that allows a lot more freeze to settle in, a lot more cold air to settle in, and cold winds to move through the canopy. So it seems like those fields were where the burn back was the worst in that north central region, talking to several of the county agents and the growers. As far as what growers can do, again, we need to wait a little bit more. Let's give it another few days. We have some moisture today that is happening around the state, and hopefully there's some more on the forecast now for the weekend. That can really help the crop, especially can help it make yield out of those secondary tillers as long as they were not affected. Sometimes if most of those tillers were actually affected, the crop might start new tillers. They will come out of the crown, out of the base of the plant, and new tillers might emerge. In that situation, the yield potential would be really compromised. So if a crop right now needs to rely 100% on tillers that are being formed now after the freeze, we need almost perfect spring conditions to have any yield potential out there. So it's challenging. This will be field specific. There will be a lot of variability in field to field because of positional landscape, because of the variety planted, because of planting date, population, many factors. So growers will have to have an assessment here in the next week to see how much of the crop is actually bouncing back. What's the actual potential of that crop? And make a decision. In some of these fields where we have a very high amount of tiller loss and the crop will rely a lot on those late tillers, secondary, tertiary tillers, likely the yield potential is going to be pretty low, very reduced because of that. And so I have to take a decision there on going to a summer crop or something along those lines, which can be a very tough decision to make.
Well, you're going to continue to monitor this, obviously. You're still willing to take image samples, if you will, via social media. If a farmer would like to send in a representative idea of what's going on in their field, you'd more than likely be willing to give them some input?
Definitely, yeah. I've been already getting quite a few, either by email or on social media. So on Twitter there, at KSU Wheat. Again, that's at KSU Wheat. And I've been getting several images, and we're going on discussion with farmers there. And I'll be out in the fields again, and I'll be updating you as time goes by.
Be looking forward to that. Romulo, thank you for keeping us in the know on what's happening out there, and we will talk about this again when things become even more definitive on freeze damage to the Kansas wheat crop. Always appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension. More is coming your way after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And now to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling yesterday in the case of the county of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund leaves open now the possibility that the EPA could regulate groundwater. The High Court vacated and returned a ruling to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco. That Ninth Circuit previously had ruled that pollution discharges traveling through groundwater into navigable water require Clean Water Act permits. Writing the majority opinion for the Supreme Court, Justice Stephen Breyer said releases of pollutants to groundwater that eventually make their way to navigable waters require permits if they are the functional equivalent of a direct discharge. Now, according to the majority opinion, a key as to whether a discharge is a functional equivalent of a direct discharge focuses on the terms time and distance. The court's decision may still expose farmers and ranchers to Clean Water Act violations as they relate to groundwater. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association and other agriculture groups filed an amicus brief in the case, raising concerns that farmers and ranchers could be subject to expanded CWA regulation. NCBA Chief Environmental Counsel Scott Yeager told DTN that the court's opinion leaves a lot of discretion to lower courts and the federal government to determine which groundwater discharges would fall under the Clean Water Act. He went on to say it's highly likely now, in his opinion, that the EPA would want to develop a rule to implement this decision and provide further clarity on what's in and what's out, as he put it. Now, in that majority opinion, Breyer said the court has not entirely resolved the legal question. Groundwater currently is regulated at the state level and is not considered to be a pollution point source. On April the 15th of last year, the EPA released an interpretive statement reiterating the agency's role in groundwater. The agency said Congress excluded releases of pollutants to groundwater from permitting requirements and instead left regulation of those releases to the states and the EPA's other statutory authorities. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission Agricultural Advisory Committee, meeting by teleconference this week, focused on COVID-19 impacts, with the livestock market situation also discussed. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue addressed the meeting, reminding that the USDA's cattle market investigation now includes volatility linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. The USDA senior advisor Dudley Hoskins said later that there was no deadline for the conclusion of that investigation. The CFTC's Livestock Market Task Force is also looking into the situation. CFTC Chairman Heath Tarbert said that the regulator is putting all of their efforts into making sure that they understand during the period of immense volatility exactly what's going on in the markets. As part of that effort, he said, they're talking to the exchanges, talking to market participants, to clearinghouses, just to make sure that, quoting here, we get a sense of basically any indication that prices are moving in an uneconomic manner related to the underlying commodity cash price. He also cautioned little public information is being offered on the task force's efforts unless the regulator opts to take a concrete action on the enforcement side. And there's more reporting on China aiming to buy more crops for its state reserves. China is looking to buy more than 30 million metric tons of crops for state stockpiles, this in a bid to avoid supply chain disruptions from COVID-19 and to meet its pledge to buy more U.S. farm commodities. That's according to sources quoted by Reuters. This follows up reports from JC Intelligence on the planned purchases for state stockpiles, also making reference to current prices as a factor in that apparent decision. That country plans to add 20 million metric tons of corn, 10 million metric tons of soybeans, and 1 million metric tons of cotton to its state reserves. On we go now to this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Here's Marcia Boswell.
Over the past few weeks, farmers have taken major hits, not only financially, but also when it comes to the weather. The week of April 13th through the 17th saw another round of cold temperatures that have potential to cause freeze injury to the 2020 wheat crop. With Kansas reaching devastatingly cold temperatures, it's important for farmers to scout their wheat. Factors to watch out for include the growth stage of the crop, air and soil temperature, duration of cold temperatures, and snow cover. Based on simple wheat development models and observations from K-State Research and Extension personnel, the wheat growth stage around Kansas ranges from tillering to Feeks 5 in the northwest part of the state to flagleaf emergence or boot in the southeast region. Most of the crop in south-central Kansas is at the first or second node, and the crop is less developed as we move to the northwest. For fields that have not jointed yet, the crop generally withstands temperatures of 15 to 20 degrees fairly well, especially if the growing point is still below ground. This is the condition for most of northern Kansas. If the growing point is already above ground, first joint visible, wheat can sustain temperatures down to about 24 degrees for a few hours. Minimum temperatures below 24 degrees for extended periods of time increase the risk of crop injury. While soil temperatures can help buffer freezing air temperatures if the growing point is below ground or near the soil surface, the buffering capacity decreases as the crop develops and the growing point moves away from the soil surface. Thus, expect a positive effect of the soil temperatures in north central and northwest Kansas, where soil temperatures were sustained above 38 degrees during the entire week, and the crop is still at tillering through Feek's 5 stages of development. Along with watching your wheat during the changing weather, it's also important to scout wheat for stripe and leaf rust. According to Dr. Eric DeWolf, plant pathologist at Kansas State University, it is prime time for growers to be out looking for diseases while they are checking for potential freeze injury as well. There were a few reports of stripe rust from Oklahoma, and a Twitter report of the disease in southeast Kansas bordering Missouri. To date, extension agents, crop consultants, and growers all indicate that rust is not widely active in Kansas. DeWolf says look for the characteristic yellow, rectangular lesions of the stripe rust pathogen. He added that sometimes on the young plants around the joining stages of growth, we don't often get the rectangular look to some of the stripe rust lesions. With the wheat crop in south central and southeast Kansas approaching or already at the flagleaf emergence stages of growth, farmers are encouraged to be on the lookout for diseases. More information about freeze injury and how to identify wheat rust diseases is available at our website at kswheat.com. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather is next, here on Agriculture Today.
When a thunderstorm approaches, follow these safety tips. Lightning, known as the underrated killer, usually strikes the tallest objects, so avoid standing beneath trees or other isolated tall objects. Take shelter in a sturdy building. Remember, if you're close enough to hear thunder, you're close enough to be struck by lightning. Help keep you and your family safe this severe weather season. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Rounding out this Agriculture Today, it's our weekly stint on Kansas agricultural weather. We're in touch once again with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. Mary, the month of April was predicted to be wetter than normal, and this past week there was some catching up in that respect, you say.
Right. We did see some significant rains across the state in this last week. We have a very big deficit to fill, and we didn't by any means erase that, particularly in the areas that were worst impacted. But we started out, if you look at actually the start of the week, we go back to the 15th of April for the week that goes into our U.S. drought monitor. And that was dry, as was the following day, which is pretty much what we've been seeing for most of April. But then we kicked it off with a fairly nice round of storms the 16th into the 17th. Statewide average was about 0.4 of an inch, which is not insubstantial, and some of that fell in the western parts. A little bit drier on the 18th and 19th and the 20th, but all of those days actually averaged measurable for the state, which has not been the case. Our last round overnight yesterday came into a statewide average of 0.38 of an inch, and the wettest spot was 2.22 inches. So again, some fairly decent amounts in the end of this period. Statewide average for the week was 0.32 of an inch, and that's 0.31 of an inch below what we should have had for the week. So we didn't make up a whole lot. And again, part of the problem is the distribution. When we look at the western third of the state. Southwest came out the best. They averaged 0.12 of an inch, and that is less than a third of what they normally would get in the week period. So it's not surprising that conditions have not improved there.
And we have regularly here, Mary, been tracking the dryness in southwest Kansas for quite some time. They desperately need some good moisture in that area. But when you look at the latest drought monitor, you say, Mary, there is a pocket in north central Kansas which is wanting as well right now.
Right. North Central averaged only 0.15 of an inch for the week, which is about a quarter of what they would typically see. But their year to date, they are actually the driest division. If you go back to January 1st, they've averaged 2.33 inches in that North Central division. And that's less than half of what they would normally see for the month to date. Even the Southwest is better than that. They're at 3/4 of what they would normally expect to be from January to the current point. So well warranted to have that abnormally dry added to the drought monitor. We may see some pullback in parts of central Kansas when the rains that we saw yesterday and today get added to the tally, because we did have fairly good moisture going through that central part of the state with this last round of storms. We'll just have to see how that balances out.
And then there's southeast Kansas with its overabundance of moisture.
Right. They actually, for the week ending on Tuesday, had a fairly dry week. They were about half of what they would normally see for the week. And then we had Wednesday and Thursday, and that had some significant rains, particularly in the far eastern corner. Cherokee County, our Mesonet station there, reported 2.23 inches of rain on the 22nd. So quite a bit of moisture. And that's the way if we look at the monthly through April to date, it's like you get a couple of dry days and then you get a half an inch or 3/4 of an inch of moisture and you're back to square one as far as getting out and getting any field work done.
So what's ahead? And there is rainfall in the forecast for the remainder of today, numerous locations in Kansas, and another chance perhaps later into the weekend. But after that, will we see a run of relatively dry days?
Actually, we will. And keep in mind when they give you that outlook for precipitation, in many cases, they're not necessarily talking about a lot of precipitation. You'll want to check that out. We were a perfect example here in Manhattan. Yes, we had rain yesterday, but it was 1/100 of an inch. And that's not going to settle the dust in western Kansas. So the 6 to 10 day outlook is for drier than normal across the state. So everybody will get a dry window, which will be welcome in the east and not so welcome in the west. Then you go into the 8 to 14 day and it flips to a statewide outlook for wetter than normal, which of course would be a nice start to May, and we'd certainly take it, but we'll see how that comes out. If we look at the quantitative precip forecast, which looks at how much moisture those chances of rain might actually produce, not quite so promising. In the Southwest, you're looking maybe 1/100 of an inch, maybe 1/10 of an inch, something in that neighborhood. If you look at the Hayes to about Salina area, it's a little bit more promising, and we're looking at 1/4 to 1/2 an inch of rain in that area. It's the eastern third that starts looking at, again, more of the soaking rains. An area in east central and southeast Kansas, they may see as much as 2.5 to 3 inches of rain. The peripheries of that heavy rain area, they're looking at 1 inch to 1.5 inches. So again, the haves will continue to get it, and the have-nots may not see much.
Temperatures more seasonal for the remainder of the month here?
Actually, they're looking to tilt towards warmer than normal. It won't necessarily be scorching. Our highest temperature last week was 81, and it might surprise people to realize that was down in southeast Kansas, not in southwest, where we typically will see our warmer temperatures this time of the year. But it is expected to be warmer than normal, both in the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14. One of the things we'll look at is whether it's those warm daytime temperatures or whether we keep those nighttime temperatures more elevated.
Very well. Mary, as always, our thanks. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. And a good weekend to you likewise. Please be back with us on Monday right here. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.